Silas, it's so good to be with you today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you
Thanks
for
having
joining me. You're welcome. We are talking about the book of Genesis still, and we are in the beginning of this Rooted series. And we have covered quite a bit of narrative so far, but we're entering chapter 26 this week and going all the way to chapter 47. What can you tell us about what has maybe just occurred to give us a refresher? And then also, there's a lot covered in this section. So what are some of the key points of the narrative?
Yeah. So we have the threads of Abraham and Isaac. We have the sacrifice. We have the thread after that of Sarah dying. And like with those pieces, there's so many threads that you could explore that lead into this next portion with Isaac and Jacob and Esau and their whole family narrative. But it's just such a rich place to live into. We're jumping into the stream of someone's family history. And I think we find in the messiness of their family, we find our lives and our families in the same way. That's an encouraging place to reinforce how this text wraps us into the life of God.
So this narrative has a lot of realism in it.
I would say so.
A lot
Absolutely.
of messiness.
Yeah.
That is comforting.
Yeah.
That's good to hear.
So this is a little behind from where our section is, but when Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, one thing we might miss is Isaac isn't heard from. In Abraham, he goes and he sacrifices the ram. And then Sarah dies, and she dies in one place. And Abraham goes and mourns for her from another place, and he's living in another city. It's about 50 miles from where they live to. And it's striking that, like, we don't know after the sacrifice. Does Abraham go back to Sarah? It would seem like not, because she dies in a place separated from him. And so, like, what does it look like when we follow the faithfulness of God and it seems to just separate us out from the people that God has given into our lives? Like, those are questions to wrestle with. What do we do with the messiness of that?
Absolutely. When it comes to looking for core themes, we've talked about that in a few other conversations I've had in these Rooted conversations. What kind of themes can we look out for when we're seeing the messiness and we're seeing maybe more chaos than things coming together in a good place? What can we look out for?
Yeah, I think one thing we continually want to be looking for is the goodness of God, the redemptive arc of Christ. Because, like, as Christians, we're reading these Old Testament texts in a way that reveals Christ as Lord. And so that's one thing we want to carry through. Like, we're reading a shared religious text that isn't always read in that trajectory, but as Christians, that's something we take on, right? We want to read the scriptures in a way that reveals Christ.
Can you speak to any specifics that might occur in this particular story? Like, where might we see some of that redemptive narrative happening?
I think one thing that immediately comes to mind is the reconciliation of Jacob and Esau, in the way that Jacob is anticipating Esau to come with 400 warriors and to take them out, essentially. And he's fearful. He splits up his family into two parts and then says, well, if Esau comes and takes this part of my family, at least I have this portion. And what he's greeted with is a hug and a kiss and reconciliation in a way that says, you've anticipated me to be malevolent to you, but that's not who I am. Even though there's been wrong, there's been deception, there's been deceit early on. So maybe that's a place to explore how in Jacob and Esau's story, there's a redemptive thread that starts to move forward.
So is reconciliation, is that a theme that we can look throughout the text?
I think so. Yeah,
You think
absolutely.
so? Wow, that's beautiful. That's a great piece for us to take away. Do you have any other encouragements for us as we continue to read?
I think one of the things that's most exciting with these stories that that again wrap in different parts of our lives, in brokenness, in redemption, are the questions that come up when we read these stories. I think that's one of the most exciting pieces of the whole Bible, but especially these Old Testament stories that are so rich. So an example would be like, who do we associate ourselves with when we're reading, and why does that association happen? And then what does that association say about my theology, my view of the world, and who God calls me to be with, to challenge that and call us forward into a life of redemptive, reconciling work with Christ.
So if I were reading, you can tell me if I'm hearing this correctly. If I'm reading the text and I see myself in a particular character and I'm like, oh, I really relate to them for doing this, or, I am selfish too, is it, when I'm doing that, should I be looking at the specifics of what I'm seeing in that character, or how would I practically think about that in a way that's beneficial? Like, oh, I relate to them. What more do I do with that?
Yeah. Immediately what comes to mind, it's not necessarily in this passage of text. So I'm going to go backwards a little bit. But you have the story of Abraham interceding over a city, right? And he's interceding in such a way that he says, hey, God, will you spare the city for 50, for 40? And he has a countdown all the way. And eventually he gets to 10 and he says, God, let me intercede just one more time. Let me come to you one more time. Will you spare the city for 10? And then God says, yeah, if there's 10 righteous, I'll spare the city. And then eventually, God walks away and he walks away and they go their way and the city isn't spared. And one way to read that text is to say, well, I guess that's the way God is.
Yeah,
right?
God's mean.
That's it.
I guess that's how he is.
But if we pay attention, God has just told Abraham and Sarah the chapter before, nothing is impossible for God. Don't even try and pretend to ask for something that's too extravagant or too grand. Nothing is impossible for me. And now you have this time where Abraham's able to intercede for the salvation of a city, and he stops at 10. He says, I'm going to stop at 10. Let me ask you one more time. Does Jesus do that? Jesus interceding and weeping over Jerusalem and over the city and says, I'm not going to stop at 10. God doesn't stop at 10. The redemptive arc is that what Abraham isn't able to do, which is continue going down. I don't know why he stops at 10. God doesn't stop at 10.
Right.
God continues for the goodness of the city and the people and all creation to even offer his own son's life, his own life. And so that's where we start to see this thread of what does it mean to live that kind of life? That Christ fulfills what we're not able to do. In all of the things we try, we're going to mess up. God can redeem that. And then how does that then inform my continued action of trying to live and create heaven on earth with Christ by the power of the Spirit?
Wow. That is a beautiful encouragement. I'm going to be thinking about that all day. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you for being with me here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.